Hello, everyone. This is Elise DeGeorge from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and NREL, PNNL, the Department of Energy, and all of the WREN members would like to welcome you to WREN webinar number 9. WREN is IEA Wind Task 34, or WREN, which stands for Working Together to Resolve the Environmental Effects of Wind Energy. And we are part of a nine-member countries that make up IEA Wind Task 34. Today's webinar is Adaptive Management in the Wind Energy Industry. Next slide, please. So this is WREN's 9th webinar. We began this webinar series in September 2014 in an effort to achieve WREN's goals to facilitate international collaboration that advances global understanding of the environmental effects of land-based and offshore wind energy development. Each of our webinars offers perspectives from multiple nations on research, monitoring, methodologies, and results of wind energy and wildlife interactions. For each of these webinars, which are held quarterly, we communicate the upcoming webinars through a number of different forums. If you would like to make sure that you are receiving notice of all upcoming webinars, please send a blank email to the email seen on the screen here. And all webinars and associated presentations are archived on our WREN Hub, which is at tethys.pnnl.gov. You can also find more information on WREN on the IEA Wind site at www.ieawind.org. Next slide, please. So this WREN webinar number 9, Adaptive Management in the Wind Energy Industry, is a synopsis of a white paper that Dr. Andrea Copping and Finlay Bennett and a full team of WREN members have worked on for quite some time. We're looking forward to hearing about it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the two presenters, and then I'm going to hand it over to Andrea Copping. So Dr. Copping is from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. She is a senior scientist with PNNL, working across many scientific disciplines to determine the implications of human stressors on marine resources and ecosystem processes. She serves as the research lead for environmental effects of offshore wind development on behalf of the DOE and co-leads the International WREN Initiative Annex 4 task on environmental effects of wind energy under the IEA Wind Committee. Dr. Copping is a distinguished faculty fellow in the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs at the University of Washington. She's also an associate editor of the Coastal Management Journal and on the editorial board of the International Journal of Marine Energy. Also speaking today is Finlay Bennett from Marine Scotland Science. Finlay is a group leader of the Marine Renewables and Environmental Advice Group within Marine Scotland Science. He provides scientific advice to Marine Scotland colleagues and Scottish ministers regarding the environmental assessment of both plans and projects. He works to reduce the scientific uncertainties associated with the environmental impacts of these activities, particularly on habitats and species afforded statutory protection under national and EU law. He graduated from the University of Edinburgh. Please go ahead, Dr. Copping.
Thank you, Elise. As Elise mentioned, we're going to talk about adaptive management in resolving wind energy and wildlife conflicts today. And my colleague Finlay Bennett and I represent 2 of the countries involved with WREN that Elise has described, and we're going to actually do this as sort of a duet here, back and forth, so please bear with us. What we're going to do is just talk very briefly about this adaptive management white paper that WREN has just completed, and talk a little bit about the value of adaptive management in resolving wind and wildlife effects. Finlay will discuss background on adaptive management in wind energy. We'll look at some of the application of adaptive management and wind energy in the U.S., also look at some examples from other WREN nations and focus on some from the U.K., and then end just with telling you what's happening next with this white paper and making sure we have some time for questions and discussion. Elise has really told you about WREN, for those of you not familiar, and really to put this in context, these white papers are a key product that WREN will produce over its lifetime, its international cooperation across multiple nations, and present to the IEA Wind Committee. This adaptive management paper is the first one that is completed. We have several others in the works, another one to come out shortly. But this is sort of our, our debut on these. And as Elise mentioned, please go to TESIS and learn more about WREN, and this is where we will be posting this white paper as well as a summary of it and so on after it comes out. Okay, so to dive into this a little bit, we know that land-based and offshore wind continue to face controversy because of potential threats to birds and bats. Siting of land-based wind has become more difficult in a number of areas, and for many countries involved in WREN, and certainly the U.S., offshore wind is really just at the very beginning of its process, and we already know that siting and permitting has been challenging. It's also clear that the scale of potential concerns for migratory birds and bats makes it very difficult to adequately monitor the effects that wind might have on them at the scale of a single wind farm. But we make our siting and permitting decisions at that scale of a single wind farm. So this is sort of the conundrum that adaptive management is trying to help with. Adaptive management, as a very sort of brief definition, we might say is a systematic process that can be used to improve policies and practices by learning from the outcome of management decisions. It's also very tied up with trying to decrease scientific uncertainty that is driving a lot of these sort of conflicts and concerns. We believe through this as a WREN group and through the development of this white paper on adaptive management that adaptive management does have the potential to bridge some of this divide and to help with understanding effects on bird and bat populations. But at the same time, we think that there are pathways to really maintain our forward progress on siting and permitting wind farms. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over to Finlay, who's going to give us some background on adaptive management and wind. So Finlay, you go ahead.
Thanks, Andrea. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the presentation. So, to understand where the term adaptive management comes from, I think it's worth going back to the original and seminal text, Adaptive Environmental Assessment and Management, which was published in 1978 by Holling and his co-authors. And they were concerned about very much the same issues as we're concerned about. They were even frustrated by several of these issues, and that very much comes through from their text. So they identified the pervasive sense of inertia and paralysis that can accompany decision-making bodies when they are confronted by scientific uncertainty. They very much questioned if the assessments that had been undertaken, where they're based on lengthy qualitative discourse, are really informative for decision-making. And so too do they question if the large amounts of data they saw being collected were really informing decision-making in an effective way. And they very much considered there is a need to transcend a gap between the state of science using modelling approaches to assess environmental impacts and the tools and processes that wider society relies upon to make decisions, especially when confronted by uncertainty. And finally, they also considered that the resilience of natural resource systems and their ability to withstand impact were often being ignored by decision makers. So their goal that they set out in the textbook was for scientific uncertainty to be embraced through risk-based decision making rather than being treated as some unwanted inconvenience by decision makers that could somehow be ignored. And whilst the authors set out why they felt adaptive management was needed, they were somewhat lighter back in 1978 on what it needed to be in practice. And so over the following 40 years, there's obviously a lot been written about it, often diverging points of view, and there is a risk that it could mean all things to all people. Next slide, please, Andrea. I guess in the United States, most progress has been made, obviously, and government institutions have sought to formalize what is meant by adaptive management. And the 2009 technical guidance published by the DOI is a culmination of that. So Andrea's already given you a snippet of what the definition was, but I thought I'd tease out some of the key messages that I feel are important for our particular context of wind energy. So some of my take-home messages are, if we're not reducing scientific uncertainty, then we're not really doing adaptive management. Modelling that's informing the environmental assessment isn't evolving to keep up with the best available science. Again, I think it would be difficult to argue that we're actually doing adaptive management. It's clear there needs to be some change that can be measured. So intrinsic to adaptive management is tolerance of change, and it's very much important to acknowledge that. And this is perhaps one of my own hobby horses, but it's not an open invitation to gather lots of data, or what I'm calling data-rich but information-poor, or drip. So adaptive management must be question-driven. The questions must have utility for the decision maker, who's ultimately going to want to make inferences using the models that are supported by the quantity of data that gives us desired levels of confidence for them. And of course we have to acknowledge, especially in our context, that it can take a long time and cost a lot of money to reduce scientific uncertainty. And if it's going to cost too much or take too long, then we should reflect on whether we really need to reduce the scientific uncertainty when we're making decisions. And of course, much of the rest of the technical guidance, while much of this is about enabling good quality science to be done in essence, much of the rest of the technical guidance also gives considerable attention to the social science aspects of decision making and how to bring disparate points of view together to enable them towards a closer consensus over time. Next slide, please, Andrea. So it's also worth reflecting on how adaptive management fits in with other policy tools that decision makers can use when dealing with uncertainty. So in the center of this slide, I've essentially put up the mitigation hierarchy. So setting out, that decision makers can either choose to accept the impact, or they can try and avoid the impact by allowing less of the activity or making the activity happen somewhere else. And if they still wish to reduce the amount of impact, they may consider mitigation. And if they're still not content with the amount of impact, they can also consider compensating it or offsetting it in some way. And in the bottom left-hand corner, I've just stuck in the precautionary principle. And of course, where there's scientific uncertainty about the size of the impact, they may apply the precautionary principle. And this will result in a bit less acceptance and a bit more avoidance, or it should do at least, a bit more mitigation and a bit more compensation than would otherwise occur. And the key point is that that as a management response isn't really doing anything to reduce the scientific uncertainty, and it's not really doing anything to improve future decision making. So in Europe, at least, policymakers have recently been asking themselves if an overly risk-averse approach has been adopted with respect to dealing with impacts to some protected species, especially in the context of wind farms. And if this is a concern, then obviously better implementation will mean having more appropriate levels of risk understanding, risk aversion, and risk tolerance. And I very much believe, if you put the next bit up, Andrea, I very much believe that the proponents of adaptive management will point out that they can help. Scientific uncertainties associated with levels of impact and the efficacy of mitigation and compensation can all be reduced through the adaptive management approach. And in my view, if this is done with not by abandoning the precautionary principle, but by reframing it to give more proportionate and balanced risk-based decisions. Next slide, please. So this slide is just taken from the technical guidance, and it's a cycle of learning and doing. So obviously, having recognized that there's a problem, the activity is appropriately designed and implemented. Monitoring of the relevant scientific uncertainties will take place. The results are evaluated, and this allows appropriate adjustments to occur. So how does this fit in with the kind of cycles that we have for making decisions about wind farm projects? So if you put up the next set of bubbles, please, Andrea. Here we go. So I guess perhaps the design phase of environmental assessment as part of the EIA process can be compared with, that's everything that happens up to the point of submitting an environmental statement and a decision to consent being made. And consent decisions often have conditions attached to undertake monitoring as part of implementation. And of course, the original ES should have or will have had scientific uncertainties associated with them that can provide points of reference for a question-led approach. And so and in this slide, I'm suggesting that the learning that might be applied to the monitoring that gets done could be used to state the statutory advice about what the actual impacts are and what the magnitude of the effects are, and that might go on to inform future decisions. But it's not necessarily as simple as that. And if you go on to the next slide, please, Andrea. And again, yep, that's it. I guess I think that perhaps adaptive management can be thought of as two different feedback loops. So what's called single loop or double loop learning. So in the inner loop or the single loop learning shown here, where just is written in the middle of it, this is where the management of the activity being monitored adjusts based on the results of the monitoring. So I think a good example would be where there are bird or bat mortalities at an operational wind farm. These are monitored, and based on the results, some mitigation is applied at that wind farm. Perhaps it would be curtailment, for example. So I think double loop learning would be where the learning outcome is not merely applied to the project location where the monitoring was taking place, but also informed a number of new decisions, perhaps about other wind farm project proposals. So the focus is more on the government institutions learning about the risks and making improved decisions with greater confidence about future projects. So taking the same example of bird and bat mortalities from collision, to make improved decisions about collision risk, we use models of the collision risk in the United Kingdom. To improve the modelling, the monitoring may focus not just on the number of collisions, but also on the avoidance behaviour of birds and bats. How many are flying through the area, and at what spatial scale are they responding to the presence of turbines? And by improved quantification of the avoidance rates used in these models, we'll be able to make improved decisions about collision risk of new projects. So even where the issue is the same, e.g. collision risk, the way that adaptive management is applied will vary depending on the type of learning that is required. And this in turn will have consequences for the question that we're asking in the study that we're designing in order to reduce the scientific uncertainty. And as a very general point, I would argue that the full potential of double loop learning is not generally being realized at the moment, and perhaps a little bit more effort needs to go into that aspect. Back to you, Andrea.
Thanks, Finley. So Finley's given us a great background that we examined in this adaptive management white paper, and this sort of, different scaling where adaptive management is being applied in term, at least, at single wind farms, but perhaps we need to be looking more broadly. And the way that we addressed this is we looked at a number of adaptive management plans in U.S. wind farms, and found that there were really few actual adaptive management plans in use in the U.S. We examined 16 plans quite closely. They mostly were labeled as bird and bat conservation plans, and we really looked to see how they fit the U.S. Department of Interior adaptive management guidelines. What we found was almost all the plans focused on federally protected species in the U.S., the Endangered Species Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, etc. We found that there was considerable variability among plans, even how adaptive management was defined, if it was defined, and also the overall perspective of what role adaptive management ought to play in permitting and managing wind farms. We also found a lot of variation in how mitigation measures might be applied, and the two major categories there are certain of the plans bounded or had predetermined limits on how much or what type of mitigation might be brought into play, while others were much more flexible and left wide open. We also surveyed a number of wind energy practitioners in the U.S. We had a total of about a dozen from wind development companies, regulators, consultants, and NGOs. And what we did is we asked them about their involvement in wind projects that had been associated with adaptive management plans and what their experience had been with the outcomes, the costs, the efficacies, the successes, and the challenges of adaptive management. And again, we found that, they all agreed there was great variability in U.S. adaptive management plans for wind energy. And they felt that variability was due to a lack of consensus around the concept of adaptive management versus how it's put into practice. It was also noted there are very limited implementation tools to help developers, consultants, and others, and regulators really understand how to apply adaptive management. And it's important to note that there's a real range for risk of appetite among wind energy developers, because we have to acknowledge, as I think Finley said, there is some degree of risk when you leave some of these management tools or management outcomes open. We found among our interviewees there were considerable differing opinions, however, on whether adaptive management that is in use at a single wind farm is actually real adaptive management. There was quite a push-pull on that one. There was pretty good agreement that it has to be hypothesis-based. However, as Finley noted, there are other management tools that also require hypothesis-based scientific data gathering. And there was a lot of contention about how useful adaptive management really is when it's left very wide open and adaptable, if you will. There was pretty common agreement, however, there is financial risk associated with this uncertainty surrounding adaptive management, not only as a practice, but that reducing uncertainty and leaving some of the mitigation open really does present some financial concerns. Okay, we also went to the other WREN nation countries and asked for input on adaptive management as it's applied in their countries. And what we found pretty generally, and the green box on the lower right-hand side of your screen, these are the 9 WREN nations. And what we found was that there was really limited legislation that even speaks to adaptive management in any of these countries, including the U.S. There's no formal regulations found in any of these WREN countries that insist on the use of adaptive management for wind energy permitting. But we did find a number of countries had used conceptual attributes of adaptive management to regulate wind energy. The U.S. and the U.K. are probably the greatest applicants of adaptive management, and that's why we've talked about the U.S. a little bit, and Finley's going to talk about the U.K. in a bit. But in the meantime, I just want to show you a little bit of the outcome of what we heard. Now, this table up on your screen, you're not going to be able to read it all at all, but I'm just whetting your appetite because it does appear in the adaptive management paper that I'm hoping you'll all want to read when it comes out. But what you see is a great deal of no laws specific to adaptive management, no formal regulations. We heard that pretty loud and clear. So what I want to do is just tell you a few stories of the sort of use of adaptive principles that we heard from these different countries, because I think it provides sort of a range of the kinds of possible tools adaptive management could bring to bear and some of the very practical outcomes we've been seeing. First of all, out of Portugal, again, no formal adaptive management, but there is a wind farm in central Portugal that had been operating for several years with a monitoring program for birds and bats. But what they discovered after 3 years of operation was the most commonly killed species was the kestrel, and they weren't even monitoring for kestrel. It had not been thought to be present in the region. So what they did was undertake a complete change in the monitoring plan to really favor the kestrel, and they developed site-specific mitigation program, and that was done very much in cooperation between the developers and the regulators. And though it's still early time, it seems to have dropped the kill of kestrels. Their site-specific mitigation was very much associated with establishing kestrel habitat, not directly in the area of the wind farms, but at a slight distance, and promoting extensive livestock grazing away from the turbines so that there could be increased habitat heterogeneity. A second example came out of Norway. Again, no formal requirement for adaptive management, but Statkraft, who is the owner and operator of the Smola wind farm, where there are concerns about white-tailed eagles, voluntarily undertook an extensive research program to really understand what mitigation strategies might work. And although most have not been implemented, there has been considerable testing in the field for this species and actually some mitigation for other species that has made quite a difference. One of the other aspects they undertook, they found that some of their ground-based birds, like ptarmigan, were running into the towers. So they alternately painted black and white patterns on the towers and rotors, and that seems to have had considerably good effect as well. Another story we heard was out of the Netherlands, where most of, in fact, all of their wind activity is focused on offshore wind. And again, no formal use of adaptive management, but their adaptive principles are very much being brought to bear in siting and permitting of these offshore farms. They resulted in a number of changes fed back from existing data towards their monitoring programs. And much of the concern was focused around the noise, the acoustic output from pile driving for offshore wind turbines on both porpoise and fish. So, and one of the notable items out of the Netherlands was very much the planning for 10 offshore wind farms in quite close proximity, and the putting in place of plans to really look at bird, bat, and marine species over that whole area rather than focusing on a farm-by-farm approach. When we get to Switzerland, there we go. Switzerland has the highest altitude wind farms that have been developed so far in the world, and there has been considerable resistance to expansion of the wind farms. To be honest, there's one turbine in place now, and they're trying to expand, but no expansion has been allowed under their regulations until there is really good information available on the migratory birds and bats. And what's notable here is that the monitoring outcomes of bird and bat species have been used to set up a curtailment plan that has been done in a very collaborative way with stakeholders who have helped set the limits and the requirements for curtailment, then are reviewing those curtailment requirements on a periodic basis to really understand how new data is informing those management decisions. And finally, one more example from Spain. Again, no formal requirement for adaptive management, but it was found that wind farms in southern Spain were killing a number of species, including the griffon vulture. They have an innovative program of monitoring these birds in flight, stopping the turbines, continuing to monitor for the birds, and then restarting the turbines. And here we have a little bit of actual feedback data with a 50% increase in bird mortality following 2 years of operation and a very minor drop in energy production. So these are just some of the examples we heard, and as we tried to tease out what are the adaptive procedures and policies and activities here that are actually helping both with establishment, expansion, and operation of wind farms. So I'm going to turn this back to Finlay to talk a little bit about the UK perspective.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. I think, in fact, my perspective is even more limited in the UK. It's really a Scottish perspective, I'm afraid. But I've got 3 more slides on adaptive management approaches in Scotland. And this is my first example from terrestrial wind. So currently there are over 153 operational wind farms in Scotland. And there's a recognised need to learn from existing and ongoing monitoring, particularly of birds near wind farms. And so this group, the Scottish Wind Farm Bird Steering Group, has been established quite recently to inform the next generation of terrestrial wind farms in Scotland. Often existing locations will be repowered with more modern wind turbine designs and perhaps with larger wind farms as well. So the aims of the group are to provides an independent scientific assessment of the impacts of wind farms on birds, and the group includes government bodies, environmental groups, and the developers. It also aims for better sharing and dissemination of data across the wind farm industry, and to make available better data to inform key potential effects such as disturbance distances, avoidance rates, and other factors considered particularly relevant to wind. And the group believe this will result in quicker and more accurate consenting decisions in the future, and this in turn will lead to reduced investment risk for development of wind farms. And furthermore, by providing robust data to inform environmental impact assessments for wind farms, they believe it will make it possible to develop in relatively more sensitive locations than is currently feasible through the current precautionary approach. There's a concern that all the least sensitive areas are essentially used up by the existing 153 wind farms. And they also aim to reduce the need for survey work for future wind farm proposals by improving the evidence base associated with the existing. And I just thought I would share those. You can go onto the website and look in more detail, but I think these aims collectively very much resonate with an adaptive management approach, even if the term isn't used by the group at any point. Next slide, please, Andrea. So turning to the marine environment, where there's been far less development of marine renewables, especially in Scotland, there is a policy ambition to move relatively quickly to establish multiple wind farms as well as tidal energy arrays as well. So if you look at the rest of the UK, there already are multiple offshore wind farms that have been operational for over a decade, and monitoring of the impacts is taking place. And an important review of post-consent monitoring at these operational wind farms is undertaken by the Marine Management Organisation, who published their findings in 2014. And perhaps the most important conclusion their report reached was that there's a real risk that post-consent monitoring studies are often statistically underpowered. So the report found that too often the results of post-consent monitoring were reaching meaningless conclusions of no significant change. Because these studies were underpowered, they were doing very little to increase our levels of confidence associated with the changes that will inevitably have occurred. And at best, this is providing scraps of information to inform future use of models. And of course, it's the classic example of drippy monitoring, large data sets that are resulting in limited amounts of useful information. So I guess you could take quite a critical perspective of adaptive management in the UK based on that finding, because post-consent monitoring appears in the offshore context to have seldom been cost-effective, and it hasn't had a good track of meaningfully reducing scientific uncertainty. So the reasons why monitoring is not resulting in learning are multiple, and in the UK they often are technical reasons relating to the design of the monitoring. So perhaps it's answering questions that simply aren't going to be useful for the decision maker. Or perhaps it's monitoring that's not led by a clearly defined question in the first place. Or perhaps the question is well defined, but the study design is not going to be able to provide the information needed to answer the question in a meaningful way. So for example, a before-after study design will not provide the same level of information as a before-after control index design. These other designs that are more statistically advanced, such as before-after gradient approaches. At a non-technical level, one of the concerns is that this finding of no significant change is often all too easy a way to mollify those who aren't really numerate and those who wish to believe that our actions don't actually come with risks or consequences. So in order to respond to these challenges, we need more coordination, and that's been provided partly in Scotland through the Scottish Offshore Renewable Research Forum. So bringing together academics, NGOs, government agencies and developers, agreeing what the key questions are for research, and where necessary commissioning background research to enable those key questions be more effectively answered. So, for example, Marine Scotland has commissioned work on developing a power analysis tool that can be used by developers in different parts of the country when designing their monitoring strategies. We're also doing work on population modelling to better inform decision-making regarding the potential risks to population. And then another key part of our approach is to establish regional advisory groups to implement a question-led approach to monitoring at the regional scale rather than the project scale. Collaboration between developers is going to be more cost-effective and is more likely to provide results with meaningful levels of confidence. And then where technologies are new and there's not yet the opportunity for regional coordination, and a good example of this is the Maygen tidal turbine array, then using the project as a demonstration project with more public funding of the monitoring and more direct involvement by academic institutions in the data collection is a way of making progress. And that's been done under the umbrella of what we've badged the survey, deploy and monitor policy. Again, this is a risk-based approach. The regulator for Maygen is allowing an initial deployment of 6 turbines. The intention that the subsequent phases will be informed by the results of the demonstration monitoring. I know it's not offshore wind, but it's an exciting time because the first electricity was just exported by the Maygen project last week, and I think the first data is going to be gathered anytime soon. So Scottish Government is also doing other things. We're also putting funding into what's called the Offshore Renewable Joint Industry Programme. That's a major collaboration at a UK scale of farm developers and government bodies to answer questions regarding bird behaviour and collision risk at a wind farm called Thanet in England. So by pooling resources together to more effectively answer a key question that's impacting the entire industry, and which will make real differences to the way we use collision risk modelling in the future and how we make decisions about future projects. Next slide, please. So I also thought it was worth reflecting upon some of the remaining challenges that exist that are going to have an impact on the uptake of an adaptive management approach. And from a UK perspective, I think the Department of Interior's technical guidance is the best document we have that sets out the approach, and I regard it as essential reading for anyone who wants to apply adaptive management. And we don't have an equivalent publication in the UK, and so there is no endorsed guidance, and that's limiting the profile that adaptive management actually has as a concept in the UK. Secondly, I believe that we find in the UK one of the main barriers to effective implementation of an adaptive management approach is the prevalence of drippy monitoring that isn't actually reducing scientific uncertainty. And so doing post-consent monitoring half-heartedly to tick a box is probably the worst outcome. It's wasting money gathering data, not leading to better decision-making. So what's very much needed is a question-led approach, and the various scientific technical issues associated with hypothesis-led monitoring need to be addressed through doing good quality science. And thirdly, whilst adaptive management can be used to address concerns we have in the UK that assessments are overly precautionary, it still entails defining tolerance thresholds of potential change. And a key challenge will continue to be the amount of risk to populations of animals that regulators should accept when applying adaptive management. And so there are two sides to this. How much is society willing to pay in order to meaningfully reduce scientific uncertainties? And how much risk of change to charismatic megafauna in particular is society willing to accept in order to achieve adaptive management goals? And it will be the answers to these questions that dictate not only the rate at which renewable energy is deployed, but also the effectiveness of adaptive management approach. Okay, back to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Finlay. Okay, we're ready to wrap up here. The final adaptive management white paper that we've been Finlay and I have been drawing information from, is going to be publicly available for download in early December. It's actually in the hands of the IEA Wind Committee right now, as of yesterday, and they will be, accepting it, we hope, and it'll be published on TETHIS, so stay tuned for that. And if you're on any of our webinar or TETHIS blast lists, you'll get an announcement of that. I will be doing a shorter presentation on this at the NWCC conference in Colorado later this month. And I think this also has implications will be brought to bear in the international workshop that is also being held at the front end of the NWCC. So if any of you on the phone will be in Broomfield and haven't looked at that workshop, you might want to do that. And that's really it. We are really hoping, we want to thank you for being on this webinar, and we hope that you will read this paper with interest, recognize it as a white paper that is bringing together existing knowledge, but it's also really trying to spark discussion, have many people with an interest or even opposition to adaptive management engage in these processes, talk them through, and see how we can do an even better job for the wind energy industry. And with that, I'll wrap up, and we'll answer any questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Finlay and Andrea. One question. You mentioned the financial risk of adaptive management. Did you encounter any examples where developers incurred a financial hit?
I guess that question's to me. Thanks, John. We did not get any quantitative information, and I can't say we found any concrete evidence. However, it was mentioned by every wind developer, it was mentioned by every consultant, NGO, and the regulatory community seems to be aware of this too. So it's either a very, very well-shared myth, but we think that it is real, and there's a little bit of a very small amount of analysis in the paper, but this is really a topic that could do with some real delving into. Just to define the risk a little bit, the application of adaptive management to some extent implies some open-endedness that additional monitoring requirements or mitigation could be required down the road. And developers hear strongly from their investors that this level of uncertainty does not sit well with investors. So that's really the scope of the financial risk.
Okay, thanks. One more question for you. Is the international wind energy industry beginning to adopt adaptive management more formally, and what roadblocks are there? So big picture.
Let me take a crack at that, and then Finlay, you might want to weigh in. What we found is, first of all, recognizing that in the U.S. and the UK to date, there is no formal requirement to use adaptive management for wind at all. That the Department of Interior technical guidance is that the reason we chose that as sort of our benchmark, if you will, is because that is the closest there is to be really laying out what adaptive management should consist of and talking about how to apply it. And it is being applied a reasonable amount in the wind energy industry in the U.S. and from what Finlay's told you to some extent in the UK. What we found in the other WREN countries was that there was really no formal requirement, and it was necessary to dig into the principles of adaptive management to find whether these are really being applied. And what we found is, in principle, they are. But as far as I know, there are few moves towards really formally, codifying in any of those countries. Finlay, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd say that this is anecdotal rather than anything more formal, but in the UK, the wind energy industry is quite positive about the approach, and that's as a result of experience of alternative options. So it's partly because they're expressing frustration where they're asked to undertake monitoring, no apparent underlying reason for doing the monitoring, so they feel that's wasting money for no real benefit. And also there are examples where they feel that the regulators aren't taking a proportionate level of risk. They're being overly precautionary in their decision-making, and there are examples of wind farm project proposals that aren't going ahead because of concerns about the impacts on wildlife populations that are based on modelling frameworks that are believed to be precautionary. So there's a recognition that by doing higher quality science that reduces the scientific uncertainties, that more proportionate decisions. and that adaptive management provides a way forward.
Thanks, Finley. I was just going to add to that in the spirit of the original question. What we found, at least among the REN, the members, the representatives of the REN member countries, a lot of interest in adaptive management, and we see these kinds of collaborations like REN as perhaps being a way to, shall we say, spread the word, and there may in fact be some countries that pick this up. We see these international collaborations like this one, where one or two countries like the U.S. and the U.K. are moving more strongly to something like adaptive management. This may be a way to transfer that policy and that technology to another country. So any more, John?
Yeah, great. Thank you. We got one coming from Scott Merriam. Isn't there a risk to the government public when adaptive management is used? For example, what happens if the developer installs a project but then can't pay for mitigation measures determined through adaptive management? Should they have to decommission the project? Who covers these costs?
I think that it's a great question, and it's a hard question, and slightly different variation on that. We actually wrestled with a good deal, and it turns out philosophically and policy-wise, it depends on where you are. It depends on the country. Finley, can you talk a little bit about the situation in Scotland or the UK? I remember we talked about if there's curtailment needed and loss of revenue, who covers that?
Yes, it was some of the other REN members on the continent in Europe who had the good examples. And if I remember rightly, they were saying that the balance of risks often in European countries sits with the government body, and whereas the consequences, and as I understand it in the United States, are more likely to fall to the developer. So in the UK, if for example there are more impacts than were estimated, then government will have to address the cost of sorting that out. And so there's a lot of discussion within the group about the polluter pays principle and where that fits in to that big picture. But yeah, that partially answers the question, I think.
Yeah, so this is exactly the long discussion we got into, and a lot of aha moments, is the U.S., and curtailment is the easiest one to, I think, put a finger on. What if curtailment is required, which generally leads to a loss of power generation, loss of revenue? In the U.S., well, the developer's just on the hook for that. There are other countries where once permits are issued, the government can be on the hook for that differential in income. So you've got to figure out where you want to put your wind farm, I guess.
In the UK, we don't have curtailment as a management response. It's not used at all that I'm aware, or maybe in some very limited circumstances. Its focus is very much on the initial siting of projects in location.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question for you. Can learning from adaptive management be shared between projects, or is the learning more site-specific?
Let me take the first crack, and then I'm going to let Finley delve into that one a little more. This is the basic conundrum I think we were facing, that most adaptive management per se in the U.S. is being applied at the single project level. And our thesis is, at least partly, that this may not really give you the kind of information you need because of the mismatch of scale of a single project, both spatially and temporally, versus a population of an entire population of a bird or bat species of concern. So yes, there is definitely some kinds of learning that can be applied at the project level, and those quick little examples I gave you from some of the European countries, I think, demonstrate that. But the paper really tries to make the case that the best use of this adaptive management process is probably at a broader level, planning for future projects, as opposed to this very short, small, single-loop learning at an individual project. Finley, do you want to pick up from there?
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely right. I think it's important to recognise that there are different types of learning, and they all have their value. But the thing is to reflect upon what learning outcome you want to achieve from a particular situation. Often, it might be the case that you do want to just apply learning from a project at that project level, and I think that, as I understand it, is often what's done in the States through looking for carcasses of birds and bats that have collided. But I think adaptive management can also be applied in a double loop sense to look at learning from existing projects and apply that learning to change the modelling assumptions we're making with regard to the assessment projects and make improved decisions about those future projects. And I think that type of learning is more difficult to do, but also is potentially a very powerful form of learning that will really change the way that government institutions approach environmental impact assessment. And so it's one that probably a bit more effort should go into. But either type of learning is going to have these challenges around how to gather sufficient data so that you've really in the confidence. And if you're trying to learn at the project level and relate that to population scales, there's a mismatch there. And that's one of the reasons why we've very much promoted it with our development community to try and collaborate either through meta-analysis and standardized monitoring at many different project locations, or literally pooling resources one design that's applied at a regional scale. So I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you. One other quick question. Are you aware of any adaptive management being used in to answer any other questions other than environmental risk? And is there any carryover that can be drawn from other applications?
Well, adaptive management, let me answer the last part of that first. Adaptive management is much more generally applied in other fields of environmental conservation and restoration. The one that I'm most familiar with is in terms of wetland loss and restoration. So there's a big literature on that. Now, in most cases, that deals with particularly being able to identify restoration targets and being sure that as these restoration of habitat are carried out, that they are actually coming up with equivalencies and so on of ecosystem processes. I am not particularly familiar with too many others that are really analogous. As Finley mentioned, the tidal and wave industry in the U.S. and elsewhere have been going forward with adaptive management. So that is one worth looking at. If you want to get on TESIS, put in adaptive management for marine energy, you will find that there are a number of plans that have been written there, taking a somewhat different approach than we have with wind, because in the marine energy space, mitigation is really not something we've gotten to yet. It's pretty much along the do-you-just monitoring program. But outside the environmental space, not my field, and I'm not aware of it. Finley, any thoughts on other, maybe socio-econ or anything?
Well, but the definition of adaptive management is about natural resource management. So it's very clear in the Department of Interior's technical guidance. So the way they've chosen to define it, I would argue that it can only be applied to management of environmental issues and environmental risks.
Going back to haulings, I agree. I think that is the intent. I just didn't know if anyone had ever used it elsewhere or differently.
I mean, in that context, one of the classic examples is wildfowl populations and annual monitoring that takes place in order to inform decisions about how much shooting of ducks or whatever is permissible. That's relatively straightforward to implement compared to some of the challenges associated with the wind energy. I think tougher questions to answer.
Great. Well, thank you. That's all we have for questions. So, and we're after 9, so I suppose we should wrap it up. If you have any additional questions, a recording of this webinar will be posted on TFIS. You can also ask questions down below in the commenting forum there. Thank you all for joining us today.